Hey folks, welcome back. This is the Autometer Custom Shop gauge install part 2 for the HotRod Roadster, and let's get back to it. So last I left off, I had wired the gauge cluster. There she is. And I had to order the connector. Got the connector. Let's see. Easy enough. Alright. That's the connector 3299. Let's see. There it is. I also ordered that Radio Shack push button to set the fuel gauge. Alright, so this shows you how to make the connection. Need a suitable crimping tool, which I have, in order to crimp it into the multi-pin. Alright, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. No chances for failure. Good thing is that we're not using all 8 connectors on here. Yeah, I believe we're going to be using the speedometer, the tach, the ground, lamp, 12, like 4 of them. Today we're also going to be installing the oil pressure sending switch in the engine and the water temperature switch in the engine as well. So let's start cleaning this up. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get the ground from each of these multi-pin connectors that are on here. To an engine ground. So I'm going to tie all those together and split them off so I can go to an engine ground. The bulbs, these 4 bulbs that I have going together, those are going to go to a chassis ground. Then the positive of these 4 gauges here, I'm going to tie those all together and run them to a fused spot on my fuse panel with a 10 amp fuse. Nothing more than that, just a 10 amp fuse should be fine. I actually just spoke with someone over at Autometer, and that's what they told me that I can do for the positive cable. And the positive cable would go somewhere to on your fuse panel that's run power, so that there's always power to it when the engine's running. I guess it'll also have power when your key is in the accessory right before turning on the car, so that way you'd be able to gauge any kind of readings that you need, like water temperature, for instance. Here in the 8-pin multi-pin connector, I went ahead and ran the wire that I connected from all of the positive sides of the bulbs on the gauges, and I put them together on the back of one of these. I went ahead and so I put 2 cables right into here, and then I plugged it into that connection right there. On the bottom row, it's the second from the right, and then one small cable comes out, and this is a piece of cable, a piece of gray cable that I cut off from the wiring harness that I have in the car. And that wiring harness, that cable is a gray cable that actually says instrument lights. So then I'll plug the opposite side of this plug, which is this one here, to the other end of that cable, and I'll have a way to quick disconnect that. I see that there's 8 connectors here. You're gonna have your speedometer signal cable, which will come either from your Speedo, the sender right here that goes right onto the end part of your transmission. I don't have that. I have the Autometer GPS unit, so that has one signal that comes out, and that's going to go into that speedometer spot right there. The white cable from my tach is going to go to there. That ground isn't used, the VSS isn't used, but down here this will take 12 volt power, and that'll be 12 volt power from your ignition switch. The next one will be your ground cable, so that'll be, you know, the ground that you run to the battery, or actually to a chassis ground. or to a good engine ground would be best. Then your lamp, which is what I already plugged in here. So once this gets instrument lights in here, it'll light up the lighting in the Speedo Tach combo and all 4 gauges underneath. Then the next connector over is a 12 volt out basically. So this, if you wanted to power another gauge right next to it, you can run out of it and power the other gauge next to it. Now, I did not inquire with Autometer if I can take the 12 volts out of this last connector here and power all the other ones. I'm not going to try that. I'll power these 4 separately, and I'll power this one on its own, and I won't use this bottom one. So these 3 on the right here, which is the other, let's see, what's that? Yeah, the other ground, that's labeled ground, the VSS, and the 12 volt out, these won't be used on this particular install. So let me go to time lapse and just start cleaning some of this up by putting all of the powers together and putting all of the grounds together and bringing them up here to this side. So I've cleaned things up a little bit. The negative from the gauges, not from the bulb connection, but from the gauges themselves, I've gone ahead and run all of them without splicing them together. Just run all of them up this way, tie wrap them to the ground cable for the bulbs, just to have a place to guide them along. And they're all over here. There's 4 of them here. And I can put those together along with the ground that's going to be going into this connection. Put all of those together and have those go to a good engine ground. And then the bulb can go to a chassis ground. I know it's kind of like the same thing, but I will run it right to, like, I'll run all of these along with the ground that goes to this combo tach along to a good engine ground, something that's bolted like to some of the bolts that go between the transmission and the engine block, for instance. That's a really nice engine ground, I've always thought. And then this one can go just to the frame. And I have ground wires that go up behind the dash that are from the frame, some that are from the battery, and one that's directly from the engine block itself. So I'll have those separated. I don't know if it makes any difference, but hey, why not? That's how I'll do it. And then all these positives go to run, to 12 volt ignition run, along with the 12 volt that's on the bottom left of this connector here. So I'll go ahead and put a cable that comes out here. I'm going to try to find a cable that might say 12 volt run or ignition amongst my plethora of a ton of different cables of over the years having different fuse panels put together. So I'll try to find one that might have that written on there, cut a small piece so I can make a junction just like this one. For me to put that on there, and I'll tie it together with these 4. That's where we're at right now. Take a break, have dinner, I'll be right back. While I was taking a break, package came from Radio Shack. That little switch, that 275-15156, 1556 from the first video. And that goes to the black and brown wire from the fuel sender down here. So let me make that connection, and then I'll just hide it back here somewhere once it's done. It doesn't need to be long, it only needs to be about this long, just enough for me to reach over and tap it, momentary on and off. All right, so let's go ahead and solder that. Figure that's long enough. And the only thing that we'll have left will be a purple wire that I'll run all the way back to the fuel sender. Even though I already have a cable from the fuel sender coming forward, I'll just go ahead and run this one. Less resistance, just a straight shot from here. Run it in the wire looms that are already there. I might be able to even tie this to the end that's already at the dash and just pull back, kind of like if you would an electrical wire. I have to strip and solder onto this momentary push-on, push-off connector.
Garbage full.
The garbage is full?
Yep.
Okay, that means that you need me to take out the garbage?
Yeah.
You got it.
I'm gonna take out the garbage, but I want you to come with me.
Well, you can't carry the garbage. That's too much.
It's light. I can carry it.
Oh, it's light? You can carry it? All right.
Yeah, I can actually carry it.
Okay. Well, thank you for helping. Top. Let's heat these up. Done with the soldering for this installation. Well, I made a mistake. I should have put these two together and then slid the heat shrink tubing over the top of all of them. Instead, I put this heat shrink tubing in here. Now it's basically for nothing. It's not doing what I meant for it to do. But it's still good because they're each individually insulated from each other. Okay, this is going to go to the water temperature. This goes to the oil pressure switch. I still have to put all these together. And same thing with the grounds. I got these pretty cool butt connectors that are one size on one side and a larger on the other. So you got that size there and a smaller side on the other. Then there's the blue one, where there's one size there and a much smaller on the other, just in case you got to go like a single wire out of here. I think I probably have to cut these a little bit longer, but I just want to see how thick the strands are when you put four of them together. Yeah, those fit in this blue one just fine, and on the other side I'll be able to put one that's just a little thicker than that to continue on. Alright, so that might be the one that I'll use. Okay, after much searching, I found a red wire in another wire harness that I had that actually says instrument power. So this is going to be a good one to connect with the rest of these to go into the power here, and the other side of this is going to go to ignition power to give it instrument power. So what we're going to do is I'm going to put four of these into one side of this reducer butt connector, and then on the other side we'll have this wire. It's going to come out of it and join into this plug right here. And then the same thing with the ground. They'll go into a butt connector reducer. On the other side I'll have the one cable that goes into the ground, coming in from the wire that's coming from the engine ground to go to the ground connector on this 8-pin. I don't know if I'm making much sense, but if you have any questions, please feel free to comment below, and I always answer them as quickly as possible. Alright, so I think it's time last time. Alright, you might have been able to tell that I made a mistake. I made this length of cable way too long, and I got confused as to how I was going to tie all these up, and I didn't want to go with a cable from here, then to here, then from here somewhere else. So I figured I can just add another cable, the cable that was going to connect to the ignition power to begin with, and tie it into these 4 here, and then just have one come out of here and into the plug. Now I tried to use this really nice super thick red cable, but it wasn't needed. This is about 8 gauge or 10 gauge, and it's super thick, super rough to bend. I wasted one of the connectors on this and a piece of heat shrink. That's not good. So I went ahead and got another cable, and I crimped a new connector. It's a little bit more flexible, and it doesn't need to be 10 gauge. Hell, it's supposed to be between 20 and thicker, so this is a 14 gauge, which is perfectly fine. So I'll go ahead and put a piece of heat shrink on the end of this. And by the way, if you put in a terminal into here and you figure out you made a mistake just like I did, the way to pull it out is by getting a really small flathead driver, and then on the opposite side of it, you see that there's a little divot right there? Well, you can press this on the underside of it, on the bottom part, and push it all the way through. And let me show you what it's actually going to be doing. On the underside, there's this little tab right here. And when you push this part in, it's going to be going through, and it's going to be pressing this tab down. Push it sideways here so you can see it. Right around there. So what's going to happen is this little spade is going to press this part down and let it release from its hold inside this 8-pin connector. Spread open this heat shrink a little. Oh, I broke it. If you snap the piece of heat shrink when you're spreading it apart, just cut that piece off. Just slowly spread it apart, then get it in a little bit further. Alright, so now one part of it is a little bit flared. It's going to help you out. It's going to help you slide that right over. There. Make sure you don't put anything over that little tab right there. That's the tab that has to lock in. Alright, so then this piece will go into the first bottom left connector, which is your 12-volt power for the instruments. And now that's in there, we have 2 in. I'll go ahead and push that down in there. Now the other part of this is going to go into here, and then this one will go into your ignition run. So it's right here. So it's right there. Alright, I want to put a piece of heat shrink through here, so I'll go ahead and slide that over here first. I have done so many crimps to where I've forgotten to do that first, and I've had to cut and redo it, or just tape it. Okay, make sure you get a good crimp on there. I always hold both sides of these so I'm pressing together to make sure that nothing slides out. I got at least a good grip. Good tug. Great. Slide that over. Awesome. Okay, so now once I plug this cable into my ignition run, I will have power to all of the gauges. Now that's power. That's not power as in power for the lights. Power for the lights will come from this side, which will be my instrument power. So, sorry, my instrument lights. And that's how I already labeled that. So the cable that's coming in from behind my dash for the other instrument lights will get this other connector, which then will have a quick disconnect to this one. And you know what? What I'll do is I'll put the opposite connector, where this one is the male on the instrument lights. I'll put the female side on the ignition. So there's never a way where I'll crisscross the connectors and put the ignition on the instrument lights and the light switch on here. Now if you'll notice, this cable is pretty thin, and the heat shrinkable back end on this 16 to 14 gauge connector is quite large. It's not going to shrink all the way down to here, so I'm going to get another couple of pieces of smaller heat shrink in blue, put them over here, shrink them down before I crimp this down, so to thicken up this side of it. Here I have some, it doesn't have to be blue, it could be red. Here I have a couple of pieces, so I'll go ahead and just cut a few pieces, 2 for now. I'll slide this on here, and first I'll heat one part. Building up the thickness of this sheath here. Put in another piece. I'll know it'll crimp around the wire itself. Alright, so I hope that this will shrink on there and get tight around there. Let's go ahead and crimp it. Alright, let's see how much this thing shrinks. Got 2 layers on there. Alright, it worked. Perfect. So now this will go into the other side of the cable from ignition run that I'll have with this connector on the other side. So now we'll have power to all the gauges, and we'll have instrument lights to all the gauges. Once that's plugged in, now we got to hook up the ground. Alright, so here we are, we have the gauge. I've gotten it pretty far along to where I think I can put it in the car and finish everything else in the car. Got the fuel, the volts, oil pressure, water temperature, and the speedo. The 8-pin connector, I went ahead and put a pigtail on it for the instrument lights, and with the male connector, and then the female side will be coming from the fuse panel in the car. The positive for all the gauges are all put together and junctioned here with a split off going to this connection, and this is a female connection, so the male side is in the car. That way I can't confuse powering from a run on or from the light switch. They just won't connect if it's not connected correctly. On the ground side, put all the grounds together for the gauges themselves, and those are going to go to a good engine ground, and that's going to be crimped in the car. And then the lines that are going from the bulbs, the ground line that's going from the bulbs, is going to also be hard crimped, and then a piece of heat shrink put over the top of it. In the car, I've already gone ahead and terminated with one of the connectors that goes in here, which is one of these. I've already put one of these in the sending unit from the speedometer calibrator. That's going to go in this top one here. Then the Tach has two lines coming from the Tach. One line coming from the HEI distributor itself, and then another line going from the fuel pump cutoff safety switch that I bought from Revolution Electronics. It's a pretty cool setup. I've already tested it out a bit. It's a fuel pump safety switch 12003 from Revolution Electronics at revolutionelectronics.com. I got this because you can use the regular oil pressure safety switch, and that's fine. But what I found that I liked about that one is that it gives you a 3-second burst when you first turn the ignition on, and if it doesn't sense a signal coming from the Tach, then it shuts off power to the fuel pump. And that 3 seconds gives you enough time for the fuel pressure to build up and make its way over to the carburetor, especially if the car's been sitting for several days. So it's fantastic for a for a car that sits for a while. Turn the key. It gives you 3 seconds of pump. Let that pump prime. Get the fuel over to the carburetor, so when you actually turn, you're going to have less of a dry start when it comes to the gasoline in the carburetor. And it's pretty cool. And if you need more than those 3 seconds till you get fuel pressure, you can just turn off the key and then turn on the key again. You're going to get another 3 seconds. But the moment the engine shuts off, whether there's oil pressure or not, the moment the engine shuts off, so does the fuel pump. So that's pretty safe there. I like that. That 3-second burst is really the main thing that differentiates it from the oil pressure switch. So I'm going to have 2 grounds going, one from a good engine ground, one from a good chassis ground. The switch from the Autometer GPS calibrator for the speedometer will plug right into here. Right next to it will be the Tach that has 2 wires going into it. They're already 2 wires crimped into this connector. So once those 2 go in, everything is wired up, and then it's just up to me to start running all these wires everywhere they go. First thing, I'm going to clean up this area, and then we're going to go to the engine compartment, install this oil pressure safety switch, this water temperature switch, and then we'll move on from there. Okay, looks like we're ready. Time to unveil the car for those of you who haven't seen it. Take the cover off, put the oil pressure sending switch, put the water temperature sending switch in there, and then move on from there. Alright, so in my engine I have this mechanical connection here for an old school water temperature. You see the long cable there. Now I'm going to take that off. I don't want to put the new connection right here because it might interfere right here, especially with the electrical connection. So I want to pass it over to this side, then just run the line back to the back part of the engine. And I'm going to be that hard line for the oil pressure gauge that I have right now and putting in the new one. So everything will be at the back of the engine. Remove this filler plug so I can put in my new water temperature sender there. Buy a filler one for here so I can remove this. Okay. So I'm going to put in the water temperature switch first. That's going to need this adapter. It comes with a couple of adapters, one that's much bigger than this, but this is the size that it needs for the area of the manifold that I'm going to use. So we're going to put Teflon here and Teflon here. So I personally like to use the Permatex liquid thread sealant. It's part number 80632. Wish they made a smaller brush. One of these cans will last me years. The top part is a 1/2 inch and the bottom 11/16. Alright, put a rag there just in case you get any leaks. Okay, let's make sure this is going to fit. The thread is right. Yep. Okay. So there it is in the front of the engine. Some people say, oh, you should have put it on the other side. The thing is, this thing rises up about 45 millimeters just to the top of it. Not to mention the plug that would go in there and then some wires that would be bent over the top. So if you come around here, this thing is the same 45 millimeters from the top of the manifold to where this cable is bent. So any extra would hit the bottom of the alternator. So it wouldn't fit there. So I'm gonna have to move the alternator just to remove this part and put in the plug that fills it up when I go to the store tomorrow and buy it. Alright. Oil gauge. I have no idea how I'm going to tighten this. This is a large diameter piece. Oh no, this doesn't fit. This is hitting the manifold. What the hell? Alright, so apparently I've been reading, and it's a common problem with small block Chevys that have Edelbrock manifolds and they get Autometer senders. The threads are so short that it does not clear your manifold. I'd have to either grind out the manifold all on this side here in order to get this exact one in straight, or I have to go to the hardware store and get a 1/8 inch NPT in that goes 45 degree out with a female 1/8 inch, and then this will end up being like that. It's not too bad, but Jesus, you'd think that you can have this manufactured, I don't know, an extra 3/4 inches long, and I would put it right there. That'd be nice for once to have something fit straight up. Wish I would have known that. After an all-nighter last night working on this, I finally read a bunch of forums and figured out how to make it work. So there is the installed oil pressure sending switch from Autometer. Side look as to what's actually happening in there. So right there is a 1/8 inch NPT male to 1/8 inch NPT female with a curved top 45 degree that I bought at an Ace Hardware for $4. And I've seen other 45 degree little adapters where the back of the unit was very squared off and it wasn't rounded off like this one. So that squared off unit would have hit the edge of the back part of the manifold. This one just made it, and I was able to tighten it down, and it just so happens that it tightened down perfectly with it facing this way. This way, I'll give you a different angle. So that's what you see when you're standing on the driver's side. It's not too bad. The connector will go right in there. It's actually a little better than going straight up and down as far as water collecting on there, although this car does have a hood, and you're supposed to fill that in with some type of dielectric grease. You're supposed to fill in this connector over here the same before you put the connector through, kind of like to make a waterproof seal of sorts. I finally pulled out the old school sport comp gauge with the mechanical probe that went into the manifold. They didn't have a chrome plug, they had an anodized blue one over at Horsepower Sales, so I got that. Put in the liquid Teflon and tightened that down. And so now that's plumbed, that's plumbed. So this was the one that I was most worried about. I was able to get a really long 7/8 inch socket in there to tighten this onto the 45 degree adapter. I'll show you the socket. I was fortunate enough that in my dad's tools I had this really long socket, 1/2 inch drive. Slide right on there, and I was able to tighten it down to torque. So I was fortunate. I was looking over me with his tools once again. Yeah. Okay. So now to install the gauge cluster. The gauge cluster is still over here. Ready to go. This little packet that I always looked at it in this direction, that I thought was the Teflon paste for the water temperature sending unit, ended up being a kind of like a dielectric grease. It's a compound that you squeeze into the female end of the terminal and then connect it together. I guess you pour a little bit of this into the oil pressure sending switch terminal, and the same thing with the water temperature switch terminal, and then you plug it in. So that's pretty cool that it comes with that. I'll put that in there later on before I plug everything in. All right, let's go ahead and get this installed.